Hello and welcome to the channel. It's got some special news for you all today. I'm here to announce the public preview of Application Insights Enhancements for Azure Logic Apps Standard. Let's go. So a little bit about why this episode is important. So the Application Insights Enhancements for Azure Logic Apps Standard is currently in public preview. We've recently gone through private preview. I want to thank all of the customers and partners that joined us on that journey. The feedback that we received from those folks had a direct impact on what you're seeing in this public preview, and so we definitely appreciate people checking out the feature and giving us that feedback. It was really invaluable. Now, with regards to this public preview, this is an opt-in feature, so it's something that will be rolled out and made available to everyone globally, but it's not something that is enabled automatically. And so this is something where you will opt in because we don't want to break any sort of existing telemetry or any reports or queries that you might have. And because we do have some data schema changes that are actually included in this, that is something that you will have to take a look for. So if you've got a lot of investments in queries against App Insights for Logic Apps, there's a strong probability that you're going to want to change those because we have reorganized some of the data structures itself. Now, this video, I'm going to showcase much of the enhancements that we've made. I want to give you some samples and some walkthroughs just to give you more fidelity about what's been changed. And so hopefully you'll enjoy that. And then last but not least, I do want to go ahead and acknowledge some folks from the engineering team. So Nikhil and Rohitha are from our engineering team. Rohitha is one of the managers on the team itself, and Nikhil's on his team. And I work closely with these folks in putting this all together. Obviously, they did a lot of the heavy lifting from a technical perspective, and so I just want to call out their involvement and appreciate all of the help I got in preparing this content from them as well. All right, so let's dive deeper into this public preview and learn more about the benefits. All right, so let's talk a little bit about areas of investment. So generally speaking, what you can expect is some improved consistency of names and IDs being used across different events and tables. So this would be things like workflow ID, workflow name, and run ID. So I'll show you an example of these when we get more into the demo itself. Next up, the requests table. So what we're doing is we've sort of reorganized the way data is captured. And what this does ultimately allows you to reduce redundant data across tables. Now, what I mean with this is in the initial version or the current GA version of App Insights integration with Logic Apps is you kind of need to use both the request and the traces table in order to paint the complete picture. And especially if you think about the client tracking IDs and the track properties. And so what we've done is we've essentially standardized on using the request table for all triggers and all actions. Now, as part of that, we will include the tracked properties and the client tracking ID in those tables itself. So once again, I've got a demo. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, ultimately, by making some of these enhancements, you should be able to reduce the overall storage required by your App Insights. I'll talk a little bit later about filtering at source, which will also help you to manage your storage as well. We've also implemented a feature around making retry events easier to go ahead and track. This is pretty cool. I'm pretty pumped about this. We'll actually, have a single record, but then within that record, we'll have an instance of a retry that took place. So if you ever want to know if you've got retries going on, it's very easy to discover that. And then last on the request side of things is for trigger and action events, we now include the trigger/action type and the API name that allows you to query for the use of specific connectors. So this is pretty cool. And I encourage everyone to build this dashboard, and maybe I'll get to a sample. But this allows you to use your real runtime data to tell you which connectors are being used in your environment. And because you can then figure out what is the workflow that action or that trigger belongs to, you can then be able to figure out which workflow is impacted. So let's say, we've all been there, you've got some sort of like, say, planned maintenance or unplanned maintenance for some specific system, let's say SAP, and you need to know what are all of the workflows that are using the SAP connector. Well, now you're easily going to be able to do that based upon the runtime data stored in App Insights. And that's pretty cool. Next up, areas of investment part 2. So traces table. So we've reduced the amount of verbosity in traces. Like when we took another look at the data itself, we felt that there was some stuff that was either redundant or just wasn't overly meaningful to include. And so as a result, we had pulled it out to help with that. We've added some meaningful categories and log levels to provide more flexibility with filtering. So we'll go ahead, I've got a section dedicated to this, so stay tuned for that. We also have workflow start and end records now stored in the traces table. Now, naturally, we couldn't collapse this into a single row because, Logic App workflows can be long running. And so you might not ever see the start event if you've got something that's lasting, say, days or weeks or even months. And so that's why we do have for a particular workflow, the start and end records for that in the traces table. We do include batch events in the traces table as well. So this is that Logic Apps capability, or if you need to do batching and debatching using those connectors, we do have that being recorded. And then once again, we've implemented more consistency across IDs, names, resources, and correlation details. Next up, exceptions, making exceptions more descriptive. We've taken care of that. And we also capture exceptions for action and trigger failures as well. Filtering, and when we say filtering, this is filtering at source. So giving you more control over the types of events that are emitted. The reality with Application Insights is sometimes you can be sampled if you've got too much load. And probably the best way to avoid that additional load is to filter out unnecessary events. And so we can go ahead and do so. I'll show you in more details, but you can basically filter on all actions, filter on all triggers, and then also all of these various trace scenarios that I was just talking about. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then lastly, we've improved the consistency and filtering capabilities about metrics. I like this feature as well, where if you want to be able to see time series of how specific workflows are performing against each other, we can go ahead and enable that through some filtering. So that's kind of a high-level description of what's changed. But now what I've got is about 12 different scenarios that I'm going to walk you through that will help you with all of this. Now, prerequisites, this is pretty important. As I mentioned earlier, this is an opt-in feature. And opt-in means that you need to do something. And so we've got 2 prerequisites. Number 1 is functions v4. Basically should be the runtime for your Logic App standard instance. Now this is probably less of an issue now because we've started to roll out functions v4 in the portal in VS Code. If you create something new, by default it uses functions v4. In most scenarios, we've also, if you were using v3 as an existing platform setting, we've automatically updated you to use v4. So it would be odd for you to not have v4, but something to check. And what we've seen is there's been some anomalies with the telemetry if you still use v3. You'll still see some of the telemetry show up, but you'll see some weird behavior around IDs. So best to use v4. That's what's supported for this feature. Then the other thing that is important is the opt-in. So in the host.json file, you need to be able to go ahead and implement basically v2 of the telemetry. And when I'm in the portal, I'll show you quickly how you can go ahead and edit this host.json file. All right, now to update the host.json file, if you're in the portal, what you can just do is go to the advanced tools, click on the Go link, then click on Debug Console, CMD, Site, www root, scroll down, and then hit the edit button. And then what you want to be able to do is go ahead and enable V2 here, and then just go ahead and hit save. It will force your Logic app service plan to restart, so just a heads up from that perspective. Alright, so scenario number one, what we want to look into is the custom tracking ID and track properties scenario. So as I mentioned before, this is going to show up in the request table. You can perform a very simple query like this: request sort by timestamp descending, take 10, and then be able to go ahead and find the record you're looking for. So to demo this, very simple request response scenario within the Logic App instance. So you can see I'm expecting a very simple payload. I've got a message, I've got an order ID. Then if I go ahead and click, let's go back to the trigger. Let's then go to settings. And here we can see that we've got a custom tracking ID, and this ID value is going to come from that payload of order.id itself. And then if we go ahead and look at compose, and we go to settings and we look at tracked properties, we've got a property called solution name, and then here I've just gone ahead and hard-coded a value. So what we can do is we can go into Postman and go ahead and call this Logic app, and then within a couple minutes we should see data showing up in our Application Insights instance. Alright, so let's go ahead, let's run a query. I just checked the latest records. Ignore the batch messages, that's something else. But as you can see, I've got 3 rows here that I'm interested in. I've got the trigger event, I've got the action, so a compose, and then I have an action response. Let's take a look at the trigger first. And if we scroll down into this, a few things to note. The success and the result codes, those should be synced, meaning like if you have a result code of succeeded, then success should be true. If you've got some sort of failure, then success won't be true. So I think we've improved that consistency. Custom dimensions is quite interesting. Number one, we're going to talk or see more about this category, workflow.operations.triggers. So if you wanted to just query on just triggers, that category would be interesting for you. It's also used inside of our filtering, so we'll talk more about that a little bit later. If we expand the correlation, this is where we see the client tracking ID. So that was something that was retrieved or was populated as part of our trigger. And then what's also interesting is this resource node. So inside the resource, you'll get the run ID. So this is the workflow run ID. This is a value that you can copy and paste into basically run history and be able to go ahead and find that. Trigger name, in this case manual. This was an HTTP trigger, but when we talk more about the connectors being used, we'll discuss this. So we've also got the workflow ID for this particular workflow, the workflow name, and then the trigger type of request as well. So once again, this would be trigger name and trigger type. These would be interesting for you when you think about being able to query for specific triggers or actions, connectors, etc. Then operation name, that'll be mapped to the workflow name. Operation ID, once again, this is the run ID for you. And then the parent ID, this is a value for the basically the workflow that ran. So if we had our traces enabled as well, we would be able to create a linkage between the workflow record and this particular, in this case, trigger. So that was our trigger. Now let's go ahead, let's take a look at an action. So this is our compose. Once again, we can see success and result code succeeded. Custom dimensions, let's explore that. Tracking ID does show up here as well, so that flows through for that, even though it was basically obtained from the trigger, or basically was instantiated at the trigger, we still see it in the downstream action. If we head over to resource, same idea, run ID, workflow name. And then because we had a tracked property enabled, we're going to go ahead, we're going to see it here. So that solution name and then the value of that tracked property. Once again, operation name, operation ID, and parent ID are all consistent for that specific action. Here's the last one. This is our response. This one, we still will see the correlation. We'll still see the client tracking ID. We don't have any tracked properties basically on this action. That's why we don't see anything here. And we've got the resource. We've got the action name as well here. And we've got the action type of response. So that's kind of the high-level summary of what you can see in the request table, especially as it pertains to track properties and client and custom tracking ID. All right, next up, our scenario is related to retries. And so what we're going to do here is I've got a workflow, and it's got a HTTP action within it, and the URL is no good, so it's going to go ahead and it's going to run. And in this case, it's going to retry every 60 seconds. And then what I'm going to go ahead and show you is, of course, what does that behavior look like inside of Application Insights. All right, so here is the workflow. So similar, we got a request, compose is the same, introduce the HTTP action. In this case, the URL is bad. And so what's going to happen is this is going to go ahead and retry and then eventually fail. I've already kicked this off. You can see that it's currently sending. So I'll pause the recording and essentially let this fail, and then we'll take a look at Application Insights and see exactly what that looks like. All right, so if we go to App Insights, let's find our HTTP record. We can see here success false. Result code has failed. Let's now dive a little bit deeper. Go into custom dimensions, then go into retry history. Then we can see the 3 retries that took place, the related error, the start time, the end time. And so yeah, if you ever want to know if a specific action has retried, you're going to see some fairly rich telemetry here. And this is actually one of my favorite features that we've recently introduced, because I feel like it makes it very clear and very easy to go ahead and detect when this has actually occurred. Once again, in our request table, I'm just querying based upon the most recent records. All right, next is connector usage. And so what we can do in the custom dimensions node is we can go ahead and look for API name and trigger type. In this case, I was interested in a dataverse. Show me basically a trigger where there is a dataverse being used. And what's important here is we can look at category number 1, so we can distinguish between a trigger and an action. Then number 2, we can provide the API name, and then lastly the trigger type. Now this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Based upon the different types of connectors that we have inside of Azure Logic Apps. Technically, there's a few different flavors. When we think about API connection, those are generally those Azure connectors. And in this case, we also see like the trigger type of API connection webhook. So it's one of those things where you're going to want to, loosen your query parameters first, then look at the various values that accompany that related record. We're also going to have an example of service provider as basically the trigger type or the action type. So when you think about service providers, that could be service bus, that could be basically functions, like any of those built-in connectors that you see inside of Azure Logic Apps standard, those are likely to show up as service providers. So it gets a little bit interesting when you think about, say, service bus, where you've got an Azure version of the connector, plus you've got this service provider version of the connector. So you do need to sort of explore that a little bit and be aware of it. And then it also gets real interesting around like built-in actions or triggers. So for example, when we talk about like compose or even HTTP, you may not have all of these properties available to you. So for example, like the API name may not be available. So that's something that you do need to consider. You do need to go ahead and explore a little bit. So let's go ahead, let's see what this looks like. All right, let's take a look at Dataverse first. As mentioned before, this is where we get into the API webhook connection type. So here, standard workflow, I've got a Dataverse connector and Dataverse trigger, and then I'm just going to go ahead and dump the payload into a compose action. If I head over to Dataverse, I can go ahead and put in basically a new record. And then what we should see is we should see that this workflow goes ahead and fires, and subsequently we see a record inside of App Insights. So we can see that it did fire, and so let's just give it a couple minutes and we'll check on App Insights. Okay, here we go. Here's our trigger record. Let's go take a look. And let's go to custom dimensions, and this is where we need to pay attention. So because it's a trigger, we're going to see trigger type is equal to API connection webhook, and then we see the API name is common data service, CDS. That's what Dataverse used to be, in case you weren't aware. Now, so that's kind of the example of API connection webhook trigger type example. Now, if we go into Compose, and we can go ahead and look at custom dimensions. Now, what's interesting here, we'll see category as workflow operations actions. Then what we're going to see is we've got an action type of Compose. But what we don't have is the API name, right? So like we'll see an action type of Compose, but we won't see that API type, and that's because in this case Compose is built in. Okay, let's now take a look at another example. I've got another workflow. We're going to use the service provider service bus trigger connector. In this case I'm using batch. We'll talk about batch a little bit later, but what we'll be able to do though is take a look and see what this record looks like inside of our telemetry. So let's head over to Service Bus. We're going to use the Service Bus Explorer feature, and we're going to just go ahead and send in a message. It can be arbitrary. So we'll go ahead and click send. I'll go ahead, pause the recording, and then we'll take a look at App Insights here shortly. All right, so here we've got our trigger record. Let's go ahead, let's explore. Custom dimensions, API name is service bus, trigger type is service provider. So that's another example of how you can query. So you do have to pay attention because these fields will change, trigger type versus action type, API name, if it is like a service provider or if it is an API connection. You'll see it there, but for some of those built-ins you may not. So but really powerful feature. I really want to see people build dashboards, inventory, being able to show what are all the connectors that are being used in your tenant. I think this is hugely powerful. All right, next one is I think something that'll be quite useful for folks, right? So show me all actions and triggers associated with a workflow run ID. So maybe you're in the run history, you can see the run ID for a specific workflow that maybe is failed, maybe it's still running, and you want to get some more insights into that. And so this is where you can take advantage of that operation ID and then be able to go ahead and populate the basically the run ID in that value, and then be able to see all of the related triggers and actions. So let's go ahead, let's see this in. Let's see how this works. Okay, so I just took an example of one of the previous executions we saw. This was that retry one, but like I said, perhaps what you're done, you're in the Azure portal, you are in the run history, you find that, hey, this workflow failed. I want to find out more details about why it failed, and then you could just go ahead, grab that run ID, and then populate it as part of your where criteria against the operation ID, and then see all of the related triggers, our trigger here, and our actions that are related to that. So I think that'll be quite useful for people as well. All right, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to start talking about the traces table, and what we want to be able to do is find workflow related records. And in this case, what we're going to see is start and end records. So the key thing here is we want to query based upon the category of custom dimensions.category equals workflow.operations.runs. And then what we will see is a record for every start and then a record for every end. Now, the reason why these are two records is largely related to the fact that you can have long-running processes in Logic Apps. And so as a result, if you were wanting to know what are these workflows that are currently executing, you wouldn't know because you didn't have the start record. So as much as I'd love to see these two collapsed, it's kind of not practical for us to go do that, hence having two different records. So let's go ahead, let's take a look at traces. All right, so I'm in the traces table. My query is where custom dimensions.category equals workflow.operations.run. I've just chosen to take the last two records, and then I'm just ordered them by timestamp descending just so that we can see the start record first and then the end itself. So if we go ahead and explore this, we will see like the item type is of type trace. We do have custom dimensions once again. Here's that category. So that's going to be pretty important. If you want to filter these records out at source, you're going to be able to go ahead and do it because of that category field itself. We've got just a lot of sort of internal properties. We've got the operation name, that's going to be the workflow name. We've got the operation ID, that's our run ID. And then this is the parent ID that does exist for this record. Now similarly, if we go up to the end, we should see like the workflow name, the run name, the same parent ID, and all of the other information that we had just spoken about. All right, so still in the traces table, and here we're going to look for events related to workflow.operations.batch. Once again, showing up in that category. So this is a scenario. Sometimes we get questions about like, well, how do I know how many messages are currently sitting in my batch? And using this query might help you in that regard, because you'd be able to know how many batch send events exist before, say, a receive event. So let's go ahead, let's take a closer look at this scenario. All right, so we've got two logic apps we need to deal with. The first is a publisher or a sender. The second is going to be a receiver. So here, when we get a message off of a queue, we'll go ahead and we'll send it to the batch. Then we've got the receiver. Let's go ahead, let's open up the designer here. And within this batch, we can see our release criteria is message based and schedule based, whatever happens soonest. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll send 5 messages using Service Bus, and then we'll take a look at the Application Insights telemetry. So once again, in Service Bus Explorer, I'll use the repeat send. I'll go ahead, I'll send 5 messages, and I'll send them 100 milliseconds apart. So those should get sent quite quickly, and then what we should see those being dequeued from our Service Bus connector, and then basically submitted to a batch. And once we've received 5 of those messages into the batch, then we're going to go ahead and process them. So here we've got our receive events, our send events. And so far we've received 1 of those messages. So we probably got caught up in a situation where the 5-minute interval kicked in, and as a result we pulled off what was currently inside of that batch. But that's fine regardless. Let's go into Application Insight and see what we discover. So here, what I've done is I've queried based upon that custom dimensions.category, and then the workflow.operations.batch. If we take a look at these records, so let's take a look at this sent record here. Let's see what else we can find in here. So we can see the category type, we can see the event name, we can see the status, the operation name, so this would be the Logic app, the run instance ID, and obviously because we've got this data here, we can naturally add these to our queries, so that's all good. And then if we wanted to go ahead and see our receive event, we could go into here, we'd see operation name batch receiver, and we would then be able to go ahead and see additional information about it as well. So something to explore, especially if you do things with batch, and this will give you some visibility that you may not have had previously. All right, now what we can do is we can go ahead and check out exceptions. If you want to test this out, you could just build a workflow and try to divide by 0 in one of the expressions. Or if you have a retest or retry scenario like I did, that ultimately fails as well. So let's go into App Insights and see what the exceptions table looks like. All right, here's our exception from earlier when we had our HTTP action that was failing. So if we go ahead and expand this, let's see what sort of information we find. So you're going to see a lot of technical information, right? This is basically kind of your standard stuff that's available in Application Insights. When we get into details, that's where things get a little bit more interesting for us. We can see kind of a high-level summary of our issue, right? We've got message, right, indicating that our host could not be found, which makes sense. Then we can go ahead and just find more of our stack trace as well. Once again, custom dimensions, like this is something that we're doing inside of Logic Apps to populate. We can see the category, so that might be of interest to you. We can see the log level. This is an error. If we go ahead and take a look at correlation, because it had a tracking ID, that'll show up here as well. And then naturally resource. So the action name, the run ID, the workflow ID, the workflow name. We also see that information here as well. So this is the workflow name, operation name. The run ID is the operation ID, and then we've got the parent as well. So if you wanted to query across the traces table to find like that workflow start and end, you should be able to use this value in order to go ahead and query for that. So I feel like the exceptions experience has been cleaned up a fair bit. And this should make it quite easy to go ahead and just query for exceptions and then be able to get more details if you need to by querying against either the traces table or the request table based upon that run ID. All right, so let's talk a little bit about filtering. Now, filtering, this is really filtering at source. Like you could argue your filter once you write queries with where clauses inside of App Insights, but that's not what this is trying to achieve. What this is trying to do is filter at the source. So basically allowing you to specify different levels of verbosity, and as a result, you can limit what's published and ultimately reduce your storage needs inside of Azure itself. Now, we'll talk about filtering kind of at two different places. Let's start with requests. And so what I'm going to show you here is specific to requests. And we've talked a little bit about category and how when you've got a trigger in your request table, it'll show up as workflow.operations.triggers. We have a similar situation for actions, workflow.operations.actions. Now what you can do for each of these categories is set a verbosity level. And so this is standard Application Insights. I'll put a link to basically the documentation that gives you the various verbosity levels, but you can kind of think of it as information, warning, error. And in this case, what would happen if we set this configuration is we would only see events where an action has failed or a trigger has failed. Now, if you don't specify this, and I did this deliberately when I showed you the prerequisites, there was no additional log level that was specified. it was going to use the default value, which is information. So if you want to tune this and reduce the amount of data that's flowing, you would have the ability to go ahead and set these. Now, a question, and it would be great to get feedback in the comments of this video, is this enough when we think about requests? Or would you want to be able to filter more granularly? So for example, are you going to filter based upon a workflow name or an action name or a hierarchy of like workflow then action? So let us know what you're looking for from a requirements perspective, and do provide a scenario that helps us understand why you would want to go ahead and achieve that. And this is still public preview, but things can change if we get the right signals, and it's there's people are convicted about it. So do let us know from that perspective. So this is once again related to the request table and the workflow.operations.triggers. Now let's pivot over into filtering traces. Now we have similar categories that exist inside of traces. We've got workflow.operations.runs. So this is our workflow runs. We've got our batch. And then I would say there's more of these internal settings, right? So if you're not interested in some of these internal events that are actually being raised, and you just want to suppress them, you have that ability. So once again, within the log level, you can go ahead and add basically an entry for each one of these categories. And if you don't, it will then pick up the default. The default is information. Now you can change the default, right? So here's a good example. The default here is warning. And then we're explicitly saying, but for workflow.operations.runs, actions, and triggers, I want to have information. So what you can even set the others for even error, because maybe you're not so concerned about workflow.host.jobs.runtime, maybe even batch, right? And set this to warning or even error, and then what do you really care about? And then basically set those to information so that you get the verbosity that you're looking for. Once again, let us know what your needs are in this area. Please include a scenario as well, because that will just help us through our prioritization process itself. But this is one of the key areas that allow you to go ahead and reduce your bill, and you can do that by filtering at source. All right, so one more scenario for you, and that is related to metrics. And what's interesting about this is because of the work that we did with the categorization, and we can now select the metric namespace of workflow.operations, that really sort of unlocks this feature in my mind. Now, do note, I am in the metrics for Application Insights instance. I'm not in the metrics tab for my Logic app. So do make sure that you're in the Application Insights instance itself. So let me flip over to that and show you what that looks like. Okay, so we are in metrics. We've got the scope is my App Insights. Now what I do is I go ahead and click on metric namespace. I go ahead and find my custom workflow.operations. And then these are the various metrics that are being emitted and that would allow me to go ahead and visualize. So let's go ahead and say runs completed. And then let's flip this to count. And then we can choose basically our time frame here. So this is over the past 24 hours. Maybe let's make this say 7 days. And so we can see, maybe that's not a good idea. Let's reduce it. Let's take that back to 24 hours. So here we can see our data. We can see the number of runs that have completed. So that's kind of cool. But now what if I wanted to add some additional filters? Now, one thing to note about filters is that if this is disabled, add filter, apply splitting, it's because you do need to enable multi-dimensional metrics. Now there is a cost associated with this, so just be aware of that. So To enable this, head over to usage and estimated costs, click on this alerting on custom metric dimensions, and then toggle this on. So with dimensions, hit OK. And so that's how you would enable that ability to do subsequent filtering. If you don't need to apply additional filters, then that isn't required, but I find that there's a lot of value in being able to apply more of the filters. So let's go ahead and set this back up. So runs completed, and then count. Now let's go ahead and add a filter. So we've got a filter of status, which is quite interesting because maybe I want to look for failures. So then I can go status equals, and then succeeded or failed. If I had failed operations here as well. So that's kind of interesting. Another filter that we can apply is workflow. So here, workflow equals, and then the various workflows that basically I have data for. So I could go ahead and select like one or more, or I have the ability to go ahead and say isolate one itself. And so this is pretty cool, where it'll give you some additional visibility. And then once again, you've got some different options here. There's some around like durations, triggers completed, same thing. If you were trying to find like triggers that had failed, that would be another opportunity as well. Run started. So you've got some good options here as well, and the ability to add filters just makes this even more powerful as well. Alright, so that concludes the video. There was a lot in there, but hopefully you find it quite useful. Any feedback, feel free to drop it in the comments. That would be great. If you're not following me on Twitter, you can find me at Weirzy. Obviously, you're on YouTube. Likes, subscribes, comments, always welcome. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon on the channel. Thanks. Take care.